Louis XIV, the Sun King, remains one of history's most iconic monarchs, embodying the zenith of royal absolutism in Europe. Born on September 5, 1638, to Louis XV and Anne of Austria, his reign began under the shadow of political instability. His father's death in 1643 left the 5-year-old Louis XIV king, with his mother Anne serving as regent alongside her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. France at the time was embroiled in the 30 Years' War and later the Fronde, a series of civil wars that erupted between 1648 and 1653. The Fronde was a rebellion led by nobles and parlements, high courts, against the crown's centralizing policies, and it left a lasting impression on the young king. Witnessing the chaos of aristocratic uprisings and public discontent, Louis XIV developed a deep-seated belief in the necessity of absolute control. He would later famously declare, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state, encapsulating his vision of kingship as inseparable from the nation itself. By 1661, when Mazarin died, Louis XIV shocked the court by announcing he would rule without a chief minister. This marked the beginning of his personal reign and the consolidation of absolute power. He systematically weakened rival institutions, particularly the nobility and the parlements, by stripping them of political influence. Instead of relying on the old aristocracy for governance, he appointed loyal bureaucrats from the bourgeoisie, such as Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who became his finance minister. Colbert's policies, known as Colbertism, focused on mercantilism, expanding France's economy through state-controlled industry, tariffs, and a strong navy. Under Louis XIV, France became the wealthiest and most powerful nation in Europe, but this economic strength was constantly strained by his ambitions. One of Louis XIV's most enduring legacies was the Palace of Versailles. Originally a modest hunting lodge, he transformed it into a sprawling symbol of royal grandeur. Construction began in 1661 and continued for decades, employing thousands of workers and draining the treasury. Versailles was not just a residence, but a carefully crafted tool of political control. By forcing the nobility to reside there, Louis XIV turned potential rivals into courtiers dependent on his favor. Life at Versailles revolved around strict etiquette, with every moment of the king's day, from his lever, rising, to his coucher and bedtime, staged as a public ritual. The palace also served as a stage for cultural dominance, showcasing French art, music, and architecture. Artists like Charles Lebrun, who decorated Versailles' Hall of Mirrors, composer Jean-Baptiste Lully, and playwright Molière enjoyed royal patronage, helping to establish France as Europe's cultural epicenter. Louis XIV's reign was also marked by relentless warfare. Believing in the glory of conquest, he engaged in a series of conflicts to expand France's borders and assert dominance. The War of Devolution, 1667-1668, targeted the Spanish Netherlands, followed by the Dutch War, 1672-1678, where he famously invaded the Dutch Republic. Although these wars brought territorial gains, they also united Europe against France. The 9 Years' War, 1688-1697, and the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, further exhausted France's resources. The latter conflict, fought over the inheritance of the Spanish throne, ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, which checked French expansion but secured a Bourbon ruler in Spain. These wars left France financially crippled, sowing seeds of discontent that would later fuel the French Revolution. Religion played a pivotal role in Louis XIV's rule. A devout Catholic, he saw religious unity as essential to political stability. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had granted Huguenots, French Protestants, limited religious freedoms since 1598. The revocation led to brutal persecutions, forced conversions, and the mass exodus of over 200,000 Huguenots to England, Prussia, and the Netherlands. This not only sparked international condemnation but also deprived France of skilled artisans, merchants, and soldiers, further weakening the economy. Louis XIV's religious intolerance reflected his belief that a single, unified faith was necessary for absolute control, but it came at a steep cost. By the time of his death in 1715, Louis XIV had ruled for 72 years, the longest reign of any European monarch. His legacy was a paradox. He had elevated France to unprecedented heights of power and culture, yet his wars and extravagance left the kingdom on the brink of financial ruin. The Sun King's absolutist model influenced rulers across Europe, but it also set the stage for the Enlightenment's critique of unchecked monarchy. His great-grandson, Louis XV, inherited a fragile state, and within decades the cracks in the system would widen into revolution. Would you like me to continue with Part 2, focusing on Versailles, culture and wars, and Part 3, covering later reign, legacy, and impact? Let me know if you'd like any adjustments in tone or detail. The death of Louis XIV in 1715 marked the end of an era, but the legacy he left behind was both monumental and complex. His reign, which lasted 72 years, remains the longest of any monarch in European history. He was not merely a king, but a symbol of absolute monarchy, one whose actions reshaped France politically, culturally, and socially. The centralized structure of governance he built endured long after his death and became a model for other European monarchies. The transformation of Versailles into a political machine was one of Louis XIV's most enduring contributions. At Versailles, everything revolved around the king. From the moment he awoke to the moment he went to bed, the daily rituals at court were designed to reinforce the king's divine authority. Nobles vied for the privilege of handing him his clothes or serving him meals. These ceremonies, though seemingly trivial, were part of a larger strategy to control the aristocracy by making them dependent on royal favor. By involving them in court life, Louis effectively distracted them from building regional power bases or leading rebellions. Louis understood the power of image and spectacle. His portraits, architecture, festivals, and court entertainments all projected an aura of majesty and divine right. He used culture and ceremony as tools of statecraft, ensuring that the glory of the monarchy was inseparable from the identity of France itself. The arts were not just decoration, they were propaganda. Playwrights glorified the king's virtues, painters immortalized his triumphs, and composers celebrated royal ceremonies with music that inspired awe and loyalty. On the battlefield, Louis XIV pursued glory and territorial expansion, but his later wars became increasingly costly and less effective. The War of the League of Augsburg and the War of the Spanish Succession drained France's coffers and inflicted heavy casualties. Though Louis remained committed to asserting French dominance, the economic strain and rising opposition among European powers limited the success of his ambitions. By the end of his reign, France's economy was burdened by debt, and much of the population faced poverty and high taxation. Internally, Louis faced growing challenges. The social fabric of France was beginning to fray. The wealth gap between the nobility and the peasantry widened. Although he improved administrative efficiency, he also entrenched a tax system that placed the burden disproportionately on the lower classes while exempting the nobility and clergy. This inequity would contribute to the unrest that exploded decades later in the French Revolution. Despite these challenges, Louis maintained an iron grip on power. He suppressed dissent, censored publications, and ensured loyalty among his officials. The secret police and an elaborate network of informants kept potential threats in check. Still, his centralization of authority created a fragile system, one that could be destabilized without a monarch of equal capability. This vulnerability became apparent under his successors, who struggled to maintain the balance of authority he had achieved. One of the ironies of Louis XIV's reign is that while he was immensely powerful, his policies often sowed the seeds of future instability. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes damaged the economy by forcing out Protestant artisans and merchants. His wars created debts that plagued France for generations. His court at Versailles, though a marvel of architecture and luxury, became a symbol of royal excess that would later fuel revolutionary anger. Louis's influence, however, extended far beyond France. He became the model for enlightened absolutism, inspiring monarchs like Peter the Great of Russia and Frederick the Great of Prussia. His emphasis on centralized power, bureaucracy, and state-sponsored culture laid the foundation for the modern nation-state. He proved that a monarch could be both ruler and administrator, artist and warrior, priest and politician. His reign became a case study in the potential and the pitfalls of absolute monarchy. When Louis XIV died, he was both admired and resented. He had led France to heights of cultural and political glory, but also left it exhausted by war and burdened by financial ruin. His funeral was modest, in stark contrast to the grandeur of his reign. Yet his tomb at Saint-Denis became a place of reflection for those who marveled at the scale of his accomplishments and pondered the consequences of his rule. In retrospect, Louis XIV's life is a story of ambition, discipline, and the pursuit of power. He was a man of immense intelligence, tireless energy, and an unshakable belief in his divine mission. His reign offers lessons about leadership, the uses of authority, and the costs of glory. Even today, his name evokes images of opulence, power, and the golden age of monarchy. Through the splendor of Versailles, the brilliance of French culture, and the structure of the modern state, the legacy of the Sun King continues to shine.